I'm delighted today to welcome Jeanine Turner, Associate Professor in the program in Communication, Culture, and Technology and the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University. Jeanine's research focuses on organizational and individual communication. Both have been upended by our lockdown, and so it's a fitting time to seek Jeanine's advice about communicating in our current environment. Jeanine, I know a lot of your work is, or one of your sort of principal ideas is the idea of budgeted presence, that this is something that we do in our lives all the time. So can you tell us first what that is, and then if it's possible to budget our presence in this current situation when our lives are so intermingled in the way you just described?
Right. So my colleagues and I have been talking about this idea of social presence for a number of years, and we've thought about that because of our digital devices. When you think about, we walk around all the time with digital devices. Some people say we touch it over 2,500 times a day. So we are constantly distracted because of those digital devices. And so the research is around thinking about how do we manage the fact that we need to be multi-communicating at all times. So budgeted presence was kind of dealing with that. What's interesting about this situation, so my research on budgeted presence was this idea of how do we budget our face-to-face and our digital time, right? And I found that digital devices were creeping into our face-to-face time. So often you'd be in a meeting and people are sitting around with their phone, on their phone while they're in the meeting, right? You don't see that on a Zoom call. Like if I was here talking with you and then I'm also, you don't see people texting on a call. People are completely focused, right? So what's interesting is we are actually giving a lot more attention to this kind of conversation and then less attention when we're off of it, right? So anyway, I think it's really important to think about how we spend time in presence, whether we're on video or whether we're not.
Yeah, thank you. So are there better and worse ways to think about our social presence during this lockdown period?
Right, so I think that, so this idea of budgeted presence, this idea of allocating certain times when you're gonna be very connected in one conversation versus another, or knowing that, I mean, if I was in a call with 50 other people right now, or many of our viewers right now are doing other things while they're maybe partially listening, right? So they're doing other things at the same time budgeting. You have to think about when can I actually do that and when can't I, right? And I think what's challenging within our current situation is that we actually might be spending more focused time at work and then more kind of budgeted or half allocated time with our family and our relationships. And I think that's a really important thing to think about. I think we're so exhausted for all this concentration that we have to think about how can I find ways to find connections and very concentrated conversations outside of the Zoom environment with our families.
Right. Yeah, because there's a funny way in which our work colleagues can actually kind of demand our attention by scheduling a meeting, for example, in a way that, maybe family members, you're not going to send each other probably a Zoom invitation. So are there ways that you could think of that can help ensure that we spend some time with undivided attention with our families?
Right. I think it means that we have to really be thoughtful about how we're using our digital devices within the context of our physical presence, because we are being very thoughtful in Zoom when it comes to those. And I think we have to remind ourselves of that. And I think it's also important if you're living with a number of people that with many different agendas and goals, to really be thoughtful that just because a person is visible does not mean they're available, right? Yeah. So it's important to maybe have very concrete, explicit conversations about when are we going to spend some, this idea of quality time, but when are we going to spend kind of invitational time with each other? And when are we going to, when can't we do that? But really being thoughtful about allocating that time as a family or within the people relationships within wherever you're living.
Yeah, thank you. So we're all in a lot of meetings, I think, whether we're in our work situation, whether we're teaching, in which we're trying to engage with large numbers of people, maybe more than we would in the world before. So do you have tips on how we can increase engagement when we're dealing with groups of people?
Okay, I really think that what's been great about this kind of situation is it's really put a spotlight on communication and how to think about it. And so I think to your point, if you have a topic that requires engagement, you have to think about how much time can I really structure for that, right? And I think if you have a bunch of people together on a call, but you're talking the entire time and there's no opportunity for interactivity, that's kind of almost wasting that not physical presence, but that visual presence time. So I think what we have to do is really think about if we're gonna schedule a Zoom call, we are suggesting that we need synchronous conversation, all of us together. So how can we make sure that we create questions or dialogue that encourages the engagement? Then the second thing that I would say is this, that I think we're finding that it's hard to jump in on somebody else in the synchronous conversation. So what I've found is, and the chat is hard to keep track of because the chat's over here and then you're talking over here. So I found that if you have a small group, sometimes creating a shared document, it gives a chance for everyone to be in a conversation at the same time. So you have the visual with maybe a shared screen and a shared document. So someone doesn't forget their idea, but everyone gets a chance to see it. Sometimes I think that can be helpful.
Yeah, thank you. So I wanted to try and get to some of the questions that have come in. So May George from Smith College asks, many students are spending around 10 hours every week because they're in class online.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any evidence about the psychological or mental effects of spending that much time online?
Well, in terms of my research and how that much time done, I'm not as familiar with that, but in terms of the thought that in terms of what I think about is that I think that what I'm concerned about is the lack of movement, the lack of exercise, the lack of physical activity, and then even the opportunity to move from one place to another gives you opportunity to think differently about a topic or an idea. So even if you had back-to-back meetings during a day or back-to-back classes, you still have the opportunity to get up from one class, move to another class, and think differently as you're moving from place to place. So our memories, the way we think about our ideas, they're all kind of connected to sometimes our visuals. And if our visuals never change, it has a huge impact on, I think, our communication. I studied telemedicine, and I noticed when I did studied doctor-patient interactions, if a doctor stayed in their same office and connected with people, we sometimes would have to create a reminder, say hello, ask how they're doing, ask them if they can hear me okay and see me okay. Because from their perspective, of course they can, right? But it's a new person each time. And the doctor was not triggered by walking into a new room, a new kind of clinic room. So many things are triggered that we don't even think about. And it's important to understand the implications.
Yeah, thank you. So we had a question about social media that Jennifer's saying that she actually spends less time on social media than before the pandemic. And so do you have any thoughts about is that a kind of common phenomenon, and how does one, I guess, keep up one's professional presence during this time?
Well, I think a lot of it depends on how much time you're spending with other people in your common space, because I've heard both those things, because I've been asking people about how they're working with social media, and some people have found it's the only way they can connect.
Right.
For kids who are used to a lot of the best part of school was recess or lunch, right, and social interaction, and now that's removed. In kind of a challenging way, video games are providing great social interaction, whereas we have all these conversations about, oh, kids are spending too much time in online games. Actually, it's providing some opportunity for some connection. So I think that what we're finding, it's what Jennifer is saying, she's doing less social media. I think it's where I don't think any one group is doing less of one thing. I think it's changing the diet within which we are what we're used to because of this.
Right. Yeah, thank you. There's another question about commuting time. It's funny, it's one thing I've noticed myself is that you realize over the past 8 weeks that commuting has a purpose beyond just getting you to and fro. It's a kind of buffer between your lives, in a sense, the time to unwind or get ready for the day. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, is that something that's commonly found, and do you have any thoughts about how we kind of create some space between our different lives?
Right. Well, I really think this has given us a really helpful opportunity. I think about we think about discernment and the importance to really reflect on what's going on in our lives from kind of an Ignatian perspective. And I think what's really interesting about the commute issue is, so for example, I live in, like you, Washington, D.C. area. Our commutes are really, it can be very crazy, right? So it could take me an hour, right, to go home and come here. But I usually use that commute time to connect with family and friends. So what I found in this situation is because I don't have the commute time, I'm actually not connecting with many family and friends that I usually would connect with. And so I think that the lack of that commute time has huge implications for a lot of interactions that we normally, would or wouldn't have. And then to the second thing, I think it goes back to that first comment that the person had asked about the classroom. I think no preparation for the next class in terms of just getting your mind to a new space makes it hard to find closure from the previous conversation. So the lack of closure and opening, just even in physical movement, has implications for us even to be able to concentrate, which I think makes it challenging for a long, long day of Zoom.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, what I noticed was that I use my commutes for podcast listening, and
Mm-hmm.
I hadn't listened to a podcast in about 2 weeks, and I noticed that my phone was asking me if I was still interested in the shows that I so yeah, I think there's probably lots of ways people use that time, and we need to find ways to kind of recreate that.
Right.
So, there's a question from Chris Wagner that, compared to regular conversation, what are some adaptations to our communication styles that we need to make when we're talking like this?
Wow, you mean what? I wonder what he's thinking in terms of regular communication. I guess in terms of Zoom, right?
Yes.
I think we all talk about the fact that we're really just worried about this square. But I think what's challenging about that is it puts a lot of energy on just our face and looking at our face, right? And so I think sometimes that feedback constantly makes it hard for us to even concentrate on the conversation, right? So I think there's so many, while I think there's this sense of we did FaceTime or we've done Skype and we've done video calls, we've never done it to this extent or in this kind of situation. Even when you think about the like happy hours or virtual kind of parties that we're trying to have, it's a very, very different context. And so I think that recognizing that it's not just an easy switch. Eddie Mahoney and Candles will talk about it's not this just translations, it's adaptation. And I think his point is so great that we have to really think of this in new ways. This was an emergency. Everyone had to jump to this right away. But now we're getting time to reflect on what does this mean for our family life? What does this mean for our work life? What does this mean for a team? How do we develop a team? Does it mean that maybe a class can't be for an hour and 15 minutes because of that exhaustion? Maybe you have to think about concentrated time and then concentrated interactivity. We have to really be thoughtful about how we are engaging the presence.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I guess people have different or varied reactions. I was talking to someone couple of weeks ago who said, this is great, this world where, I'm going to go to the office only 2 days a week, when this is over. So, and this person was kind of expressing the idea that he's being more productive now. And I was wondering if, kind of following from that, if you could talk a little bit about, do you have a sense that there are things that are working better in the way we're communicating at the moment and might become a part of our lives going forward?
So what I think was being lost with some kind of so much digital devices in our lives, and that we carried one around with us all the time. I think we lost a little bit of the, I don't know if the respect is the right word, but the attention to face as being special, right? And I definitely think that when we have more opportunity to interact, I think that we will value, the opportunity to actually be face to face and with someone. I think also there's going to be some challenges. It's almost like you'll have to earn the right for face-to-face with someone, because people will be worried about being sick or worried whether someone else is sick, right? And I'm even thinking about, we'll have face-to-face, but if we have masks, what are the implications of that for being able to speak? Or even if for those that are hearing impaired or people that rely on reading lips, it's going to be so challenging. So I really think that just like this event has been such a really important event for us to really think about communication in so many ways, I think as we start moving into next phases of this situation, it'll be important for us to continue to reflect on what those mean.
Yes, thank you. You mentioned sort of towards the start that that it's it's uncommon for us to be in this kind of dialogue and for me to be on my phone, although I
Right.
might do that if you or I were in a restaurant or something.
Right.
But one of our questioners has pointed out something that I think a lot of those teaching over the last 6 to 8 weeks have noticed, is that a lot of students turn off their cameras. So then you're so in a sense, they are maybe budgeting their presence, right? Because, they could be jogging, they could be in the car, they could be, doing their homework,
Exactly.
sort
Oh,
of,
please.
so I've encountered that less in a work situation, but it's certainly true in teaching. So do you have thoughts about that? What kind of strategies can both the speaker and the audience adopt in that kind of environment?
Right. Well, first, let's be clear. I do not at all think that my students are like so connected in with me. And I 100% know that when they're like, oh, I don't know my video's not working, I don't know what's going on, I know it's because, wow, they might be wanting to do something else. So I totally get that. But I think what we have to keep in mind is size is so important in this situation. If you have 3 or 4 people on a call, there's no place to hide, right? If you get to 12, to the extent to which you can't see everybody at once, or even if you see everybody at once, but there's like 9 squares, there's no way you can keep track of all those squares. So you become more and more invisible, and it becomes quickly, with the extra size, somewhat like a podcast or a television show, right? And I think it's very easy for the audience and students to have agency in that situation, right? So I think for us, I think it's important for us kind of going forward to think about what are some of our rules in our classroom, right? So maybe we have a rule about video. Now, the challenging thing with that is if you have students globally connecting, sometimes the bandwidth issues don't allow for that, right? So I think to the extent to which you might come up with some kind of rules as a group, right? That when I'm speaking, I'm going to talk for this much, then the next 10 minutes, I'm going to expect some interaction, and I'm going to call on these 3 people, right? Or even to say, I'm going to now ask you a question, and I want you to take 30 seconds to think about it, and then I'm going to call on 3 people, and I need you to be ready when I call on you, right? So I think that giving people warnings, knowing that that's going to happen, trying it out, it helps people to understand what are your expectations for me when it comes to interactivity. If I'm a professor and I say, oh, I'm all about interactivity, but I talk for 45 minutes and never get a chance for people to talk, and I never look at the chat to see that, wow, people are having problems down there, then you're teaching people while you actually don't care about interactivity. So you have to actually almost budget it within your class, and then also explicitly explain, okay, for the next 5 minutes, this is what we're going to do. And I'm going to call on 5 people randomly, but take some time to think about what you're going to say.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. And I think several times you emphasize the importance of kind of setting expectations and anticipating problems, and that makes a great deal of sense. You mentioned Eddie Maloney earlier, who's kind of the online learning guru at Georgetown. And I asked him recently what the biggest challenge was in teaching. It was a really unexpected answer. It was basically that the kind of backgrounds, behind us reveal inequalities among students that are not obvious when they're on campus and they're all dressed in the same way and that kind of thing.
Right.
Something I would not have thought about. You mentioned at the beginning kind of the foreground and the background. And I was just wondering if you had thoughts about that as an issue, and again, maybe whether there are strategies that we can use to mitigate kind of exposing, differences that people may not have been comfortable sharing, when they were face to face.
Right. And I really think that's such an important thing for us to consider. Now, obviously, people have the, the Zoom backgrounds, and more people are trying to figure out how to use that with your technology. But I think it's a reminder that we all are dealing with very different spaces. And whether it's, you're in a closet trying to connect, or you have, a bunch of other people in your family that are trying to connect at the same time, and you have those bandwidth issues, I think it is reminding us of the importance of empathy in the classroom and recognizing the value of every student and every student experience, which is why rules like everyone has to have their video on, that's not empathic, right? Everyone has to do this. You know, we have to really think very carefully about each student and also each student's context within which they're sharing that class. And it has helped me to be much more empathic as a teacher, the whole experience over the last few weeks.
Great, thank you. So a couple more questions have come in. What are your thoughts on Zoom bombings? Are behavior problems just transferred to virtual environments, or are there underlying motivations? I think this is from a teacher who's had that experience with students.
Right. I think, I think what's challenging is, I think for students, it's the first time they've had this, in a sense, kind of freedom with video. And I've been working with a program with some principals, and they've talked about the challenge of Zoom detention, or how do we create something to kind of like this behavioral issue of someone. So I think that, I think it gets back to, there's a lot of agency and power that a person has when they have control over their camera, just like when you think about a third or fourth grader having a digital device that allows them to take pictures. And so I think that same kind of care and thoughtfulness, we have to think about what it means in the classroom environment. And I think in terms of the Zoom bombing, obviously we try to do these passwords, but sometimes that's tricky because everybody doesn't have them, and so it makes it very complicated. But I think when something like that happens, the most important thing is to acknowledge, okay, wow, that happened. Let's get back to our classes, right? And so I think that recognizing that might be a feature of this environment, right? But also recognizing that the same type of digital literacy that we need to think about when talking about our children as they get smartphones and social media, we have to really think about digital literacy in this environment and getting them involved in what this community is going to be like. I think teachers have control over the classroom when it's the physical environment in a way that they don't have control over this classroom. And so I think talking about how we are all creating our community and our classroom together will be an important conversation to have.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think another kind of divide this situation has revealed is our comfort level with technology. You know, as teachers, as managers, you know, we're often less comfortable than our students or our colleagues. And I was wondering if you had thoughts on that, and do you think that's a phenomenon, and how can we think about that?
Oh, I think absolutely. In fact, I think it has created a vulnerability in the workplace, a window into each person that has been, I think, helpful in many ways. I think actually Christine Poreth, from the business school, just really recently wrote something about this, that I think that the vulnerability that's created when, you know, you're trying to be concentrating in a business meeting and you have one of your children runs behind you, right? Or does some kind of crazy thing, or like something's going on. I think accepting that vulnerability, and then also immediately helps us to accept that we are all dealing with many, many different challenges, that brings the empathy in that we normally don't have. We have this, and I think it goes back to this front stage, backstage, having access to someone's backstage and understanding what they have to deal with on a daily basis, I think helps us to be a little bit much more human, which is ironic when we think about the technology, right? Sometimes we think of technology making us less human. I think this is an opportunity for us to have more empathy and be more human.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think that's a really important observation. So I wanted to close with just a couple of comments that have come in on the chat. A couple of people have written about how much they've appreciated your classes in the Executive MBA program. We have one from Daniel Lopez who says, all her teaching during my Executive MBA have transcended in my current job as an active, I think he means he's been using them in his role as an active duty Army soldier during the COVID-19 response. And then there's another one that says, ditto, Professor Turner is a star for Georgetown. So I just wanted to make sure you got those, you got that.
Oh, that's so nice, thank you.
Because one of the odd parts of communicating I find in this environment sometimes is feedback is kind of hard. I mean, we're sometimes struggling to get those kind of verbal and, you know, physical clues that we rely on. So I wanted to feed that to you. And then I just have one final question. I mean, we've called this series Books for a Better World. And I wanted to say that we're delighted that you've just signed on to write a book for us. You know, it's very early stages, but I was wondering if you might just tell us a little bit about the book and what it'll be about.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. Well, I'm honored and just so happy to be a part of Georgetown Press. So I'm very excited about it. And basically, actually, for the past maybe 10 years or so, I've thought about presence and what is the impact of social presence on the way we interact and how digital devices have impacted that. And often I use the word social presence and people are like, oh, that seems like it's such an academic term. But when you think about it in contrast to social distancing, which everyone's familiar with now, I think more and more people are aware of the importance of thinking about how are we present on a moment by moment basis. So what this book is really about is a framework that I've worked on with a colleague on trying to better understand what are our options. And that I lay out 4 different options. One, budgeting is what we've talked about, where you kind of allocate part of your presence to one person and part to another within the same conversation, right? Another, which is so interesting now, is entitled, where you tell people to put your technology away. And nobody really does that anymore, right? I mean, how could you say that? Okay, everyone close out your web browsers and Amazon shopping while you're in my class, right? And that's even what's so funny too, is people are on a Zoom conference and it looks like they're looking at you when they're actually, wow, could be ordering something. Competitive is where I'm trying to compete with whatever technology you have. And then final, the 4th one, invitational. That's where it's not so much about the device, but it's really trying to reach you and understand you and learn about you, and conversations about trying to start that dialogue in a kind of deep and caring way. And I think we started this conversation with, you know, this idea of budgeted, and then also these deeper conversations. And I think that's what really has to not be lost, that we have to think about, sometimes we have to be in multiple conversations at once. We have to be on our technology while we're managing something else. But we also have to take the time for invitational conversations, whether that's over Zoom, an invitational conversation, or whether it's with our students, how can we find that, or whether it's with our family members in our face-to-face environments. And I think going forward, I'm really, really excited about the research, because I think it's never been more important for us to think about our presence. And I think that will continue as we move into these next phases.
Well, thank you. Yeah, this is going to be one of the first books on our new global business list, and we're really excited about that. So look forward to that. I could see from the chat that we could go on for quite a while, but unfortunately we've come to the end of our time today. But I want to thank you again for your insight and on this very important topic right now. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It's wonderful to be here.
I just want to say to everyone that next week we'll be talking to David Cloutier, who's a professor of Christian ethics at Catholic University, about the morality of opening up our economy. So stay tuned for that next week. So thanks, everyone, and we'll see you next Thursday. Thanks again, Jeanine.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.